So Autism Housing Pathways is a nonprofit organization founded in 2010. And our mission is to enable Massachusetts residents with developmental disabilities and their families to find or create sustainable, supported, self-directed housing that meets their needs and contributes to their quality of life. We are not restricted just to autism, but everything we're going to be talking about tonight is autism specific. AHP has 5 core goals: to build the capacity of families to find or create housing options for their family members with disabilities, to build the capacity of individuals to maintain tenancy, to improve the professional development of direct support staff, conduct research on the housing needs and resources of the Massachusetts autism community, which is what tonight's presentation falls under, and building the capacity of the housing sector to meet the residential needs of individuals with autism. So why did we do this survey? Well, we had a number of reasons. To start with, there was a national study called Opening Doors in 2009 that called for market research into autism housing demand. And in fact, it was that study that sparked our first survey back in 2011-2012. The 2014 Massachusetts Autism Omnibus Law called for study of the present and anticipated future statewide affordable supportive housing needs of people with ASD. The 2016 Massachusetts Housing Think Tank, which was co-sponsored by the ARC of Massachusetts, Advocates for Autism of Massachusetts, and Autism Housing Pathways, identified a small core of housing models that could be collectively adapted to the needs of a wide variety of people with autism, but did not quantify the percentages desired for each housing type. Additionally, there was a study that came out in 2021 that found that people with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, aka IDD, who chose where and with whom to live had a 74% decrease in emergency department visits, regardless of their impairment severity. And finally, we just wanted to update the results of the survey that we did in 2011 and 2012. So, basic information. We conducted the survey in the fall of 2021 and the winter of 2022 using SurveyMonkey. The questions largely, but not entirely, duplicated those in our 2011-2012 survey. Respondents were reached through a range of Facebook groups and email lists that primarily target families of teens and adults with developmental disabilities. So what was the cohort for this study? Answers had to be about an autistic Massachusetts resident who was 18 on or before October 1st, 2021. After we removed duplicates, ineligible responses, and responses that left all housing-related questions blank, we had 359 usable responses. Now, obviously, there's some limitations on this. First of all, since we don't have solid data on the actual total number of individuals with autism in Massachusetts or how old they are, it's impossible to tell what the sample size is or how representative it is. However, I will note that we did a calculation for the 2016 Housing Think Tank that it indicated there was likely a range of 75 to 100,000 individuals with autism in Massachusetts. There's an obvious bias skewing towards respondents who are joiners who participate in online support groups where outreach took place. And all of these limitations taken together underscore the need for the state to improve data collection so we can understand how representative our information is. So the survey was designed to determine the levels and types of supportive services that people need, to find out what existing services they might be eligible for and their awareness of those services, to find out which respondents have needs that are not aligned with existing services, and what are people's preferred living situations and supports. Who responded? Well, 6.7% identified as the person with autism, 83% identified as a parent or relative, almost 10% identified as a legal guardian who did not also identify themselves as a relative, And a little under 1% identified as staff who did not identify themselves in any other category. This is the distribution of respondents of those who provided zip codes. That's 306 out of the 359 total respondents provided a zip code. And, you know, while we lack data on the far western part of the state and we're a little sparse in the southeast and on the Cape, it's a reasonable distribution given where, you know, the population clusters are in the state. So the age in the cohort ranged from 18 to 64 with an average age of 24. 79% were female, or sorry, 79% were male, 19% with female, and 2% identified as other gender. About 45% had ASD level 1, which is, shall we say, the least intensive criteria. 22 or 23% ASD level 2, and 23.5% were ASD level 3, requiring the most intensive services. There were about 9% who were listed as other, and other mostly picked up people who were diagnosed using criteria prior to the division of ASD into the 3 levels used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. But we also picked up a few people with genetic disorders as their primary diagnosis. Obviously, they also had autism. Now, interestingly, just about 97% listed a secondary diagnosis. And the most prominently listed were anxiety or panic disorder, over 50%. About 45% had an intellectual disability, 37.5% ADD or ADHD, almost 33% with a learning disability, 21% with a sensory processing disorder, another 21% with depression. I didn't include it here, but there were other disorders. OCD was just under 20%. We did the cutoff for the chart at 20%, and I think OCD was like huge. So that is an analysis of the cohort at large. For the purposes of deeper analysis, we assigned everybody in the cohort to one of 5 groups. And group 1 were folks where there was a need for staffing identified at a 3 staff to 5 resident ratio, or even more intensive than that. Group 2 were people who indicated a need for prompting for at least one activity of daily living, or they had both an intellectual disability and indicated a need for 2-on-4 staffing, and were not already in group 1. Didn't have criteria for group 1. Group 3 were folks who said they were independent in ADLs, but needed assistance in instrumental activities of daily living, and were not in groups 1 and 2. Let me just back up to say activities of daily living are things like bathing, dressing, mobility, transferring in and out of wheelchairs, eating, other hygiene. Whereas IADLs are things like cooking, cleaning, shopping, money management, that kind of thing. Group 4 indicated they were independent in their ADLs, but needed some quality control with IADLs and were not in groups 1, 2, or 3. And finally, group 5 were people who were both independent in ADLs and IADLs, or they indicated they could live completely independently and were not in groups 1, 2, 3, or 4. So the breakdown, we had 15% in group 1, just about 33% in group 2, 40% in group 3, 11% in group 4, and a little over 1% in group 5. Now, group 5 is undoubtedly underrepresented in this survey because it's not likely that people who fit this criteria are participating in the kinds of support groups where outreach took place for the survey. In our 2012 survey, 2% fell into group 5, To put it in perspective, the Opening Doors report cited a 2008 study that found 4% of autistic adults living independently, with another 2% living with a spouse, partner, or family member who was not a parent or guardian. So it seems like 5% is a reasonable ballpark for the actual incidence of that group. So we can use groups as rough analogs, and let me stress that these are not exact analogs. But group 1 is considered again, these are the people who need 3-on-5 staffing or more. And this is considered an analog for priority 1 for a group home provided through DDS. Group 2, which is people who needed 2-on-4 staffing or needed prompting else, is an analog for either DDS shared living, a less intensively staffed group home through DDS, priority 2 for residential through DDS, or who would qualify for adult family care, adult foster care, or group adult foster care state plan services through Mass Health. Groups 3 and 4 correspond to folks who might be eligible for drop-in support hours from DDS, and group 5 is an analog for independent living. Let me just stop for a second and check the, yes, could everyone mute themselves, please? Okay, so if we look at the relationship of the existing safety net to the need we just described, sorry, not that we just described, but if we look at the relationship of the safety net to the actual need, one thing that stuck out was that despite a need for 3-on-5 staffing, or even more so, 26% of group 1 does not have an intellectual disability, which would normally be required to be prioritized for housing by DDS. So even though they meet the support need for a priority 1 DDS group home, they would not normally be prioritized for housing at all because they don't have an intellectual disability, aka their IQ is above 70. 51% of the cohort has too many skills to qualify for either DDS residential or for Mass Health state plan services, but they are not independent in both their ADLs and their IADLs. This compares to 42% of adults in our 2012 survey, and I think in part the difference reflects the fact that in the current survey, both groups 3 and 4 include people with intellectual disabilities, but the way we define the groups in 2011 and 2012 would have put anybody with an intellectual disability into group 1. All right, so we asked people to indicate the level of support they thought that they needed. And you can see this ranges from I'm able to live independently all the way through I need at least 3 staff for 4 or 5 residents due to behavioral considerations, as well as overnight awake staff, with a bunch of stops in between. And you can see we have a bimodal distribution, which in plain English means we have 2 peaks. We've got, in our third bar from the left at 16.8%, we've got I'm able to live independently, but would benefit from periodic monitoring, et cetera, at least once a week or once a week. And then down towards the other end, also at 16.8%, we have I need someone present at all times with more than 2 staff for 4 residents during the day and 1 staff for 4 residents at night. These 2 peaks correspond pretty cleanly to about the level of support that is provided for the leftward peak with life coaching that can be funded through DDS. And with the peak on the right, it is more similar to a standard group home of, say 4 residents with 2 staff during two staff during waking hours and, possibly 1 asleep staff at night. But we can see there are a whole lot of people, in fact, almost 70% that don't fall neatly into those 2 poles. And when we start to break this down in groups 1 through 5, we can start to see where service gaps are. Let me just check the chat a moment. Okay, again, folks mute. All right. So group one, remember, this is the group that requires the most intensive level of support. 81% said I need at least 3 staff for 4 or 5 residents due to behavioral considerations as well as overnight awake staff. Well, since that was the basic definition of group one, that's not surprising. But there were also 18.5% who indicated a need for even more intensive levels of support. And if we look under the hood at that 18.5%, of that 18.5%, 60% indicated they needed one-to-one support, and another 20% said they needed intensive medical support. And so while this 18.5% is a small percentage of the total survey population, this is a highly vulnerable subset of people. Group two. Well, again, our definition was you either indicated you needed 2-on-4 staffing, which is our highest bar here at 48.25%, or you said you needed prompting with at least 1 ADL. And so what this tells us is that about almost 50% of this group would benefit from a mass health service that provides drop-in services for queuing regardless of the housing type. That sounds a little bit arcane. Queuing is prompting, not reminders, but prompts, as in, you need to get the shampoo, you need to get your hair wet, etc. Those are cues or prompts. Drop-in services means that the caregiver is not living with you. And when I say regardless of housing type, right now there is only one mass health service that covers drop-in services for queuing, and that's group adult foster care. But group adult foster care is generally restricted to use in settings where it's either a licensed assisted living facility or the housing has a subsidy attached to the location. So not a portable housing voucher. So for instance, you could tap into group adult foster care if you live in state elderly housing, but not if you had a portable Section 8 voucher. And so that creates a problem for folks who are in this group. Group three, about 40% of this group is likely to be well served by life coaching. That would be our 2 bars, highest bars on the left, or our 2 bars on the left. Column 1 is blank, but our next 2 bars is likely to be well served by life coaching. And the remainder are folks who need some contact daily, but don't qualify for adult foster care or group adult foster care. And while technology can help with some of the folks in this situation, staffing shortages definitely present a challenge to meeting the needs of this subset when they can't live with their families. Group 4, again, these are people who are independent in ADLs, but need some help with their IADLs, some quality control with their IADLs. For this group, life coaching would appear to be the most crucial support. That would appear to cover, about 75% of this group. Or more. Okay. And then group 5, again, life coaching, it would likely be the most important type of support here. So interestingly, people may have skills, but whether they can use them is another question. So a lot of people indicated that they have living skills, but have trouble initiating tasks or freeze when something goes wrong, AKA, I know how to take a shower, but I may not do it. Or I don't know what to do if fill in the blank. The shampoo is empty. I can't turn the water off, whatever. And so 73% fit that have skills but trouble initiating. But it's actually even worse than that appears, because there's a bunch of people who answered no to that question not because they have trouble initiating or freezing, but because they don't have the living skills. So if we look at group one, which is the people who need it's the most intensive level of support, 71% of them said no to the question, do you have a lot of living skills but have trouble initiating tasks or freeze when something goes wrong? Why? Because they don't have the skills. So when we remove people like group one from the equation, we can see that in groups 3 and 4, you're looking at about 90% in each of those groups who fall into this. They have trouble initiating tasks or freeze when something goes wrong. And these are not people who are going to qualify for adult family care, adult foster care, or group adult foster care. They do not qualify for prompting services through Mass Health. Right. Now, next we asked folks what kind of supports they need to be successful. And over 85% indicated a need for assistance with money, appointment, or paperwork management. And these are the most important skills for acquiring benefits. This is a population that is at high risk of losing benefits, even if they can obtain them. And what happens when mom or dad is no longer there to do the paperwork? Beyond that, we can see that over 50% need schedules, medication management, a structured day, assistance with transition, and making choices. And this is for the overall cohort. If we look at group one with the most intensive support needs, we can say that they have some additional highly specialized needs. Over 70% need communication systems, positive behavioral supports, first then directions, and visual supports. Even in group two, almost 50% need visual supports. And so this means that people who work in group homes as direct support professionals providing supports to people with these kinds of needs need to have training in providing these kinds of supports. So what are folks' preferred living arrangements? Now, this time we can see for each living arrangement, we have, groups 1 through 4 represented in each little pyramid here, as it were. Group 5 is no longer included because starting with this question, only one person in group 5 answered this in subsequent questions, so it made no sense to include group 5. Of those who did answer the question, 54% either reported they were happy with their current living arrangement or listed their current situation as their preference. In groups 1 and 2, a plurality of respondents indicated a preference for living with parents and or siblings. But this is a group that's actually going to need a lot of support. So these are folks who might be candidates for living in an accessory dwelling unit attached to the family home using either adult foster care or DDS shared living. And both programs pay a stipend to a provider who lives with the person, but it has to take place in a different legal unit than the parents are living in. Other groups are more likely to want to live alone or with a housemate. It's very important for those for people in those groups to get on waiting lists for affordable and subsidized housing early, because it takes 5 to 10 years. In some places, it takes longer. Please note on this slide, percentages total more than 100%, as respondents could select multiple options. Who do people want to live with? Well, 81% of those who prefer to live with multiple unrelated people would like there to be fewer than 5 people in the home. 49% would like any housemates to be a mixture of people with and without developmental disabilities. In group 4, this rises to 73%. In group 1, with the higher needs, this declines to 23%. About 21% would like any housemates to be a mix of people with ASD and other developmental disabilities. In group 1, this rises to 41%. 23.5% of group 1 respondents indicated a preference for housemates with ASD only. Interestingly, only 15% indicated a desire to live only with people without a developmental disability. And so this would seem to indicate a desire for a peer group of other people with disabilities. The preferred layout of the housing. Group 1 is more likely to prefer having their own bath. Groups 3 and 4 are more likely than other groups to want to have their own apartment. And yet, interestingly, even in groups 3 and 4, they are more likely to choose to live in a setting with other people sharing the housing. And just, yep, I did not skip anything. Okay. So preferred housing type. This is a complex slide. I was trying to capture all the different possible living arrangements. To talk about the results, I'm going to go on to the next slide and say a significant plurality in groups 1 and 2, 34% and 19% respectively, favor a group home situation where the property is controlled by the families of the residents over a group home owned or leased by the state or a vendor. And this is strikingly similar to the 2012 survey when the figures were 33% and 21%. The majority of groups 3 and 4 prefer a private home, a condo, or an apartment. Only about 7% are interested in intentional communities, but with the highest percentage, almost 13% in group 1. Among adults happy with their living situations, the majority are in a private home or condo. So I briefly mentioned earlier the 2016 Massachusetts Housing Think Tank. The think tank in 2016 identified 6 housing models that could collectively meet the needs of most people with ASD. And so in the survey, we asked people to select one of those 6 models as the one that would best meet their needs. And the models that were chosen, or sorry, not the models that were chosen, the models that came out of the think tank that people could choose from were individual apartments or condos in the community, located close enough to one another to permit socialization. A facilitator and a neighbor are both paid to facilitate connections and provide support. The second model was shared living in a single family home owned or leased by a family, individual, or a third party not providing the services. It could involve substantially separate space with a shared kitchen. A third model was co-housing, in which people with and without disabilities choose to live in community while having their own living spaces. The fourth was inclusive small footprint units, which result in lower housing costs with trained management and or support providers. And examples of this would be micro units or some form of single room occupancy. The fifth was transitional housing that trains residents in the skills they need to live independently. And finally, licensed congregate living for people with intensive medical behavioral needs, because it really wasn't, they needed more support than was going to be provided in some of the other settings. So when asked which model would best meet their needs, the one that came out on top was the individual apartments or condos, followed by the co-housing and the shared living. And those 3 models between them accounted for about 75%, or sorry, 70%, about 70% of all respondents. And after that were the inclusive small footprint units, the licensed congregate living, and finally the transitional housing. We next asked people to identify what kinds of modifications they needed to be successful. And when I say modifications, I mean modifications to the property, whether it's the apartment or the building at large. You can see, again, we've got groups 1 through 4. Group 1 in the blue needed many more modifications than other groups. And in group 1, Over 50% need a land buffer, sound insulation, unbreakable glass, durable construction, a fenced-in yard, a sidewalk. And almost 50% need floor drains and bathrooms and a separate pantry. This is important because without those kinds of modifications, families in rental housing are at high risk of eviction, or individuals for that matter. So interestingly, sound insulation was important to all groups, even those who did not require a huge amount of supportive services. This is important because loud vocal self-stimulation, especially at night, can put tenancy at risk. And it's not uncommon for people engaging in vocal stimming to be unaware that they're doing it. Another reason that sound insulation was important across all groups was that people can be very sensitive to noise from their neighbors. In my personal experience, I've worked with individuals with a housing voucher who cannot live in large apartment buildings because they are so disturbed by the noise from the neighbors. Preferred locations and amenities. Well, for all groups, a town within walking distance of shops is the preferred location, with suburbs in second place. Only in group 1 is there any kind of substantial interest in a rural location. And for that group, access to walking and biking trails is also very important. Not surprisingly, the more likely people are to have to transport themselves, that is groups 3 and 4, the more important public transit becomes. So we then decided to find out how much people knew about benefits and, whether they had applied for them. And so we asked them about a broad range of benefits. And I know that the type is small, so I'm just going to read through them. DDS, Mass Health, Common Health, Adult Family Care, Adult Foster Care or Group Adult Foster Care, Personal Care Attendance Services, SSI, SSDI, SafeLink, the free cell phone, Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, and food stamps. And the answer choices were: no, I'm not eligible. No, I don't know what that is. No, I haven't gotten around to it. Yes, I'm waiting to hear. Yes, I'm on a waiting list. Yes, I'm receiving services. And yes, I was denied services. And again, I'm just going to flip over to the next page to analyze this. Over 50% of respondents have accessed benefits from DDS, Mass Health, and SSI. There's also good awareness of SSDI and SNAP. As a quick note, I will say that possible responses were standardized across programs. So very occasionally somebody would say they were on a waiting list for a program that doesn't actually have waiting lists. But that was only a small number. But interestingly, over 30% of respondents said they do not know what the following benefits are. 53% don't know what Common Health is. 40% don't know what Adult Family Care is. 38% don't know about Adult Foster Care or Group Adult Foster Care. 31% don't know about PCA. Less surprisingly, 60% don't know about SafeLink and 50% don't know about LIHEAP. So the takeaway from this is that educating special education transition staff about programs may help to increase awareness of individuals and family members of these programs and making sure that they are getting applied for early. Awareness of housing problems is much worse. You can see that we've got this second pyramid in a huge amount of people answering, no, I don't know what that is, about the 5 housing programs that were discussed, which are Section 8 portable voucher, public housing, single room occupancy housing, such as the YMCA, the alternative housing voucher program, and private subsidized housing. And if we also look at the, the people who've said, yes, I'm waiting to hear, yes, I'm on a waiting list, yes, I'm receiving services, and yes, I was denied services, it is in very poor shape. Less than 50% of respondents have applied to any single housing program. Over 50% do not know what the following programs are: the Alternative Housing Voucher Program, private subsidized housing, single room occupancy. Over 30% don't know what public housing is. Overall, less than 10% are participating in a housing program. Section 8 has more name recognition than any other program, but only about 45% have actually applied for a voucher. While there's no internal evidence in this survey related to eligibility, past conversations I've had indicate that many families don't understand that it is the income of the adult with autism that determines eligibility for housing programs and not the family's income. Next, we asked folks if they were the beneficiary of a special needs trust. And special needs trusts allow funds to be saved for the benefit of a person with a disability while preserving eligibility for certain government benefits. Fortunately, 52% of individuals indicated they are beneficiaries of special needs trusts, as opposed to 37.5% in our 2012 survey. So we've had a 15% increase, or that's not a 15, it's gone up 15 percentage points since our 2012 survey, which is great news. Let me just check the chat. Yep.
Hi.
Please mute, folks. However, the news is not so rosy about ABLE accounts. And ABLE accounts, like special needs trusts, are a way to save for the benefit of a person with a disability while preserving their eligibility for certain government benefits. They are similar to 529 college savings accounts. Only 28% indicated they were the beneficiary of an ABLE account. And this relatively poor uptake it seems to indicate that they are gaining ground slowly, even though they don't have nearly as many barriers to admission as a special needs trust. And they have a degree of flexibility that special needs trusts do not. Interestingly, group 3 has the strongest participation rate of over 36%, followed by group 1 at 34%, while groups 2 and 4 are each at below 20%. It is possible to roll funds over from a 529 college savings account into an ABLE account. So it's at least plausible that group 3 is a group that may have had 529 accounts and not been able to use them, and so rolled them over. We then asked about folks' monthly ability to pay for housing and services, including any assistance their family could give them. Between 30% and 50% of people in each group cannot afford even $500 a month for housing and services, and overall 75% cannot pay over $1,000 a month for rent and services on a sustainable basis. Private housing models do exist in Massachusetts, but in general, they focus on people who can be left alone up to 6 hours at a time, and the rate can run out of pocket from about $1,200 a month to over $6,000 a month. Some of that can be defrayed by SSI, for example. And if you have a Section 8 voucher, that can defray some of it as well. Down payment, the ability to make a down payment on housing with family assistance. Well, about half of people can afford less than $5,000 for a down payment, but there's a reasonable amount of scatter in the data. And if we take that together with the significant number of people on the far right who can actually afford a down payment of over $35,000, that indicates there may be the potential for mixed income housing, where those who can afford more might serve as what I call patient capital. In other words, they are motivated by the desire of having a housemate who is a good match for their family member. Even if we're not talking about purchasing housing, the large percentage who can afford less than $5,000 means many may also struggle with a security deposit if they have a housing voucher. Housing vouchers pay the rent. They do not pay the last month's rent, the security deposit, the realtor fee, the key fee. And so in Greater Boston, the last month in security deposit for a 1-bedroom apartment rented from a private landlord with a Section 8 voucher may be as much as $4,000. You know, if you don't have an ABLE account, even saving this amount could imperil benefits. So this is also problematic. And then we asked folks, do you know what your credit score is? And there's a very important reason to ask this question. It's illegal for a landlord to refuse to rent to a voucher holder just because they're a voucher holder. But it is perfectly legal to refuse to rent to somebody who has either a poor credit score or no credit score. And so it's important to carefully build good credit if somebody is going to use a portable housing voucher. And while it is technically possible for landlords to use alternative means of establishing ability to pay, such as requesting bank statements, many don't do it, especially private landlords. Okay. Later, Desiree, I'm going to ask you to tell me what your wow was in reference to. Oh, okay. Got it. Okay. All right, so on to the discussion. Well, we can see that the data shine a light on gaps in the current menu of services. And just to summarize what we've interspersed in the previous slides, half the cohort has too many skills to qualify for DDS residential or for mass health state plan services, but they lack the skills to live independently. There is no housing pipeline for people with intensive support needs who lack an intellectual disability. Staff need training to work with people who have intensive support needs. Drop-in services for queuing are not available in most housing situations. Workforce shortages impact the ability of people to live with support in the community. We need innovative approaches for people who have difficulty with initiating skills or who freeze when something goes wrong. Without adequate support for appointment paperwork and money management, people risk falling through the safety net. A lack of environmental modifications in rental housing puts people and families at risk of eviction. And people lack awareness of existing benefits and especially of affordable housing programs. What do people want? Well, almost half said they would prefer a different housing arrangement. And you may remember that back in one of the early slides, I referenced research showing that people who didn't get to choose who they live with and where they lived had 74% higher rate of ED visits. Most people do not want to live alone. Many of those who need more support want to be with family, but to access DDS shared living, mass health adult foster care, or to rent from family with a voucher, the person needs to be in a separate unit. Most of those who prefer not to live with family would like at least some peers with a disability present. And for those with intensive support needs, almost twice as many would prefer a group home controlled by families to one controlled by the state or a vendor agency. What about workforce development? What are some ways that could be addressed? And I'm first to say that I'm doing a certain amount of blue skying here, but we could create vocational high school programs that allow students to graduate as both a registered behavior technician and a certified nursing assistant. And that training could also cover the use of communication systems and visual supports. We could look at providing 2 free years of community college to people who have already worked for 2 years in human services with adults. We could create a pipeline of shared living providers for reverse shared living, where the housing is a permanent home for the individual. As in they don't have to move when the caregiver decides they don't want to do it anymore. And one way to do this might be by working with college programs in human services or nursing, where providers only commit to a year, but there is a pipeline to make sure there is another provider coming. And beyond work, something else that could be done, obviously, is to modify the Mass Health PCA program to cover drop-in services for queuing. All right. Now, let me just check the chat for a moment. Oh, thank you. Okay, possible roads ahead, housing. Those who have been following certain efforts for the last few years know that there has been a bill that keeps coming up in the legislature that would make accessory dwelling units created to provide housing for persons with disabilities exempt from local zoning. And that continues to be a very important thing that we need to do. We could require a percentage of units in new multifamily rental housing to include the most commonly needed environmental modifications in the same way that they are currently required to provide a percentage of wheelchair accessible units, you know, and units for people who are blind or deaf. We could look at a specialized group home model serving the most vulnerable individuals with complex medical and behavioral needs using highly trained staff. On our website, we've got some ideas around this. And getting deep into the weeds, but I suspect is critical in terms of opening the pipeline for housing, is to require that a percentage of housing funded through the qualified allocation plan and or the facilities consolidation fund serve DDS clients who do not require an institutional level of care. In other words, currently, the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation has 3 funds. They're the Facilities Consolidation Fund, which is for DDS, to create housing for DDS and DMH clients who need an institutional level of care. The housing, the community-based housing fund, which is for people with disabilities who are not DDS or DMH clients. And then there's the Housing Innovations Fund, which in the guidelines, there is nothing to indicate you could not use it to develop housing for DDS and DMH clients who don't have an institutional level of care. But when you actually talk to the people at CDAC, they will tell you that they assume that any DDS clients are having their needs met through the Facilities Consolidation Fund. And so the net result is nothing is coming out of those 3 funds to create housing for DDS clients who don't require an institutional level of care. And then finally, it might be possible to direct the Department of Housing and Community Development to disseminate information to local housing authorities about prioritizing persons with disabilities for Section 8 vouchers as a best practice. Local housing authorities have the ability to create priorities for vouchers, but over 90% of the housing authorities in the state have no preference other than local preference. So if housing authorities did this, which they can do on the local level, it would dramatically decrease the wait for a portable voucher. In my community, which adapted this a few years ago, it cut the wait by about a third. All right. And then improving family awareness through teacher training. The reality is that teachers have more contact with individuals and parents than anyone else in the process of transition to adulthood. And they are the ones who are best positioned to share critical information with families. And ideally, people with autism should exit secondary school having completed applications for a range of affordable and subsidized housing programs. Even people who are eligible for DDS group homes should complete applications for the Section 8 centralized waiting list and the DHCD Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. So toward this end, it would make sense to have education about the full range of affordable and subsidized housing programs included as part of the curriculum for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Transition Specialist endorsement. And that endorsement should also include training in lesser known benefits such as adult foster care, adult family care, PCA, and should cover ABLE accounts and the importance of having a good credit score to be able to utilize a housing voucher. Let's see. And then finally, and then we can open it up for discussion. We need autism training for gatekeepers. Difficulty handling paperwork puts people with ASD at high risk of losing benefits such as housing, social security, etc., even if they're able to access them initially. And while there are organizations that already exist to help people through accessing benefits, those folks do not necessarily have any training in autism. And so it would make sense to have specialty training in autism for people such as options and shine counselors that should say at, not as, aging service access points and councils on aging. And similarly, the staff at the housing consumer education centers around the state, such as Metro Housing Boston, RCAP Solutions, Community Team Working, Wayfinders, etc. Okay, so I'm going to stop the screen share there, and let me just open up the chat because I wasn't able to read some of the last few comments. Oh, yeah, thanks, Anne, for the comment about the transition endorsement. All right, so let me just open it up right there and we can just chat. Not a chatty group.
Hey, sorry, I'm in my car. This is Desiree with Neuroinclusive Housing Solutions and the Autism Housing Network. Awesome job. Fantastic information. So I love your questions. I do market analysis too, and so I'm always interested in how others are doing it. Have you had any discussions with your Housing and Finance Authority in terms of having, yes, a prioritization in the QAP would be valuable, but what would it look like? And, you know, ADA compliance is largely looking at individuals with disabilities who have mobility impairment. You know, what does it look like to say that they're going to have certain units for this population? Is it an actual set aside? You know, is it they have to have certain modifications? And I don't have the answers to this. I'm trying to figure it out too.
Yeah,
with a couple of states that I'm working with.
The thing is I think there's a reasonably robust literature on this. If you look at somebody like George Braddock, who talks about his 6 most common housing modifications for people with autism. And so George considers, and for those who don't know, George Braddock is a contractor out west who was heavily involved in deinstitutionalization in California and creating the homes that people moved into after that. And he's also worked a lot with individual families on modifications, allowing people to stay in the family home. And so, you know, he's got over 35 years of experience in this, and he's identified these 6 most common housing modifications that he considers to be a baseline for folks with ASD. And there are people with more intensive behaviors who need that plus. But I think, you know, my gut feel on what it would look like, and that's just it, it's a gut feel, Desiree, is that, you know, it would look like George's 6 most common with, you know, then as a reasonable modification for disability. If people needed more than that, they could request more than that. Yes, Carolyn, the slides are actually posted on my website, and just remind me before we wrap up and I will post the link into the chat. And I'll also send, actually, I've got everybody's email who registered, so I'll send the slides out that way as well. Okay.
Hi, Kathy. My name's Amanda, and I'm a service coordinator in the Springfield Westfield office. And I guess from a service coordinator's perspective, helping, so I work with the adults that have autism. And I guess I joined this training tonight, an info session, to kind of hear or maybe learn from either families or from you what could be helpful for us after they've left transition to help them solidify housing. Or, I mean, we do push the Section 8, we push the CHAMPS, but it seems like the eastern part of the state is moving a lot more quickly than the western part of the state with housing. So I wasn't sure if there was anything that we could be advocating for, or kind of how do we help pioneer this so that our adults with, I'm biased towards adults that have autism only, but kind of what can we do to help too?
And thank you. First of all, thank you for asking the question. I mean, I work with probably 150 families a year on figuring out housing options. Work individually with about 150 families a year. And I tend to use two analogies, and one I call the roadmap, and the other one I call the sandwich. And in fact, I've got a presentation I'm launching later this month called Getting on the Road to Housing. You're going to need a map and bring a sandwich. So basically, you can say it's a 5-step roadmap where, even before you turn 18, you can start to identify skills that the person has, and skills the person needs, and skills the person's always going to need help with. So there's basically 4 buckets: skills you've already got, skills you can get, skills you're always going to need some help with, and the last one is skills that will always need to be done for you. So you identify what those are. And then once somebody turns 18, they can start to get on as many appropriate, affordable waiting lists as possible. And this is the 5 to 10 year part of the 5 to 10 year process. And I am absolutely horrified when I get phone calls from people saying, my kid's 40 and they still don't have housing from DDS. Do you think I should get him on the Section 8 waiting list? So, and you could see from the stats we had about how few people had signed up. So get on the waiting list. And then, step 3 is apply for all of the benefits you can get now, which includes all those benefits we talked about. And then step 4 is, okay, you've applied for everything, and now you have this unknown period of time during which you're waiting. And that's when you work on moving as many things from in your skills buckets, moving as many things from bucket 2 into bucket 1 as possible, and creating systems and supports for buckets 3 and 4, and practice them. Because the goal is, when you get housing, all you're doing is generalizing to a new setting. And so that's the, and then group 5 is you move in, you generalize, and you kick the tires and see where the problems are. And there are always problems, right? And it can do things like, what? Our plan was always we were going to do shared living, and my kid is now at the top of the Section 8 voucher. We need to ask DDS right now to look at doing a reassessment for shared living, because we've waited 10 years for this voucher and we don't want to kiss it goodbye right now. So what I tell people is, let DDS know what your plan is and keep them apprised. When you talk to the Housing Authority once a year to try to get a ballpark guesstimate of where you are on the list, keep DDS in the loop on that. Because what we don't want is to lose the voucher when we get it. And so that's the roadmap. The sandwich, which is much shorter, is you can think of supported housing as a sandwich, namely a hamburger. And your bottom bun is the affordable and subsidized housing. Your meat and the cheese is all of the not housing related government benefits. So SSI, DDS, Mass Health, SNAP. The condiments are things you have to pay for out of pocket. And the top bun is natural supports provided by family and friends for free. And so you need all of those to make the sandwich. And so that's kind of what I try to lead people through. So
I've been anticipating, sadly, but also dreading.
okay, somebody's not muted.
Language that we're seeing.
So that's kind of, you know, to get families aware of that and have their service coordinators be a partner in that process is really important. Beyond that, there are, you know, a lot of other, you know, as I indicated in the slides, there are things on the system level that I think can and should be done. You know, like the QAP and the Facilities Consolidation Fund, because we've got a basic problem in that there is no pipeline for these people. And again, the other issue is people who, you know, have ASD level 3 and intensive behaviors, but they don't have an intellectual disability. That's another issue. So I hope that starts to answer that question.
Yeah, definitely. I know, you know, it's a very slow process. We definitely, I can only speak for my office. I know that we are definitely addressing as best we can and having conversations about this. And also that, you know, it's a round hole square peg kind of scenario where we're trying to add adults that have ASD only into traditional services, and that doesn't work and it's not fair to them. So I think now that COVID has kind of made a turn for the better, there's a lot more conversation about this ASD population and what DDS's role is. And again, I can only speak for my office, but we are really trying to learn, you know, what we can do, what other areas are doing, and how we can be innovative to help our people.
And that's very encouraging. I will say, just to share one more bit of anecdotal information, I'm seeing a steady trickle of people who are in subsidized housing and they get drop-in services from DDS. But what's going on is they are losing their housing or at risk of losing their housing because they are being targeted by their neighbors. So we see people who have neighbors throwing things at them, having their dogs jump on them. It's leading to psych hospitalizations, etc. Because the housing isn't really a good match for these folks. Allison Kleinman in the chat, who helped to fund this study? Well, you know, we wanted to do this, and part of the reason we have the luxury to do this right now is we got a general operating grant from the Cummings Foundation. So, and that grant is meant to do a lot of things, but one of the things it did was give us the time to do this. And so what our next steps are with the results, you know, that's kind of to be determined, but I was in a conversation earlier today with an organization, an advocacy organization, where I think one of the things that I'm definitely going to work on is creating a matrix in terms of what would require legislative change, what would require regulatory change, what is fairly low-hanging fruit, and what is a heavier lift, and try to go from there.
Thank you. I just want to say it was, I mean, this is my first time experiencing you present, so I was really quite impressed. So thank you. I'm also coming from New York, so I hope you don't mind me jumping in.
Not at all.
To visit.
Kathy, hi, this is Donna Keeney. And I was just wondering, what sort of creative housing have you seen, if any, either in Massachusetts or, you know, outside of Massachusetts, especially when it comes to the group 1 individuals?
So group one individuals are kind of the toughest nut to crack in some ways. And again, that's clarifying group one in our survey, not ASD level one. I know a number of people are exploring it. And one of the, when I look at that 18.5% of folks in group one who need one-to-one support or medically intensive support, and my son is one of those folks are at very high risk of bad outcomes, with having complex medical sequelae to behavioral outbursts that wind up being bad for the individual, bad for the family, and cost the state a huge amount of money. So there's clearly a need to address that. I would steer you again on the Autism Housing Pathways website. If you click on housing models, you look in there, you can see the 12 housing models that were considered by the think tank before coming up with the 6 models. And then a couple of additional models that we have been looking at since the think tank. And that includes some options under this medical behavioral piece. And it includes a number of other models as well. And for those who aren't aware, we've launched something that's taking place once a month on a Monday night called Family Housing Meetups or Family Action Meetups. And essentially what those are is from 6:45 to 7 p.m. we do a very brief presentation, and it is always exactly the same presentation. So people who've seen it before don't need to zoom in until 7. And then from at 7, we present a short video or videos about one of those 15 housing models. And then we go into breakout groups to talk about it for 20 minutes. And then we come back and do a little poll. And then we explore another housing model, another set of breakout rooms, come back and do another poll. And so we are rotating through these 15 housing models, doing 2 a month. And so we post the invites on that on our Facebook page. You can also find it on Eventbrite. So I hope that begins to answer your question.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy.
Let me just, okay, Desiree in the chat. Yeah, seeing the same co-occurring mental health challenges in your assessments too. The need for non-ID but behavioral support is an incredible gap. Yep. Focus group with autistic people who've experienced homelessness and thus placed in permanent supported housing. Report feeling unsafe and isolate themselves in their unit. Yes. And yeah, no, I've worked with somebody who essentially was terrified to leave their apartment for the year they were in there. And then they finally moved elsewhere with a roommate. And when the roommate was visiting their family for a couple of weeks, DDS wound up having to place this person in, respite for a couple of weeks because they were not comfortable being alone in their apartment. So yeah, it's a very real issue. And yes, we definitely need to get a handle on the percentage of people who are in the homeless system who have ASD.
Kathy, what do you think we as a community should be doing next to help the next steps?
Well, that's a really good question. There are layers to that. On a very local level, I think it is very important for people to work with their community, with their SPED packs, and every community is supposed to have a disability access commission as part of the ADA. And I think if we could get those disability access commissions and those sped packs together to work towards getting their housing authorities to create a preference for people with disabilities. That would be a good place to start. I'm not saying it's an easy lift, but it's certainly doable. We did it in my community and it took about 2 years of meetings. And I am more than happy to provide any technical assistance that people want in terms of what needs to go into a presentation to explain how you can do it and how it can work. So that's on the local level. Again, on the next level, the bill is going to be reintroduced for the accessory dwelling units. That is an incredibly important bill for so many people. And I think that, you know, again, reach out to your local reps and senators on that one. That is a good place to start. Again, and finally, something else that I think, you know, there are things that I think can be done on the local level that could be more effectively done on the state level, but even if you do them on the local level, it helps. You know, would your local vocational technical high school entertain doing a track for people to come out with the RBT and then the certified nursing assistant credential, for example? And I'm open to other suggestions people have, but those are the ones that immediately occur to me.
This is Fran Stanley. I would just add that to please pay attention to the Autism Housing Pathways model accessory dwelling unit bylaw, because there are elements in that bylaw that are particularly good for the ASD population to allow to have another bedroom and have an unrelated person in that bedroom to help provide services that you know, could seem extra and maybe not necessary, but that can really make a difference for the ADU to work for a more impaired individual.
And I'm very happy to report that Winchester Town Meeting approved an ADU warrant article last Thursday night that has the key provisions that, you know, the owner occupier can be considered to be a special needs trust, can be considered the owner occupier, and you can have a second bedroom. It took us 8 years to get that through Winchester Town Meeting, but we did. And when it finally went through, it was jointly sponsored by the Planning Board, the Disability Access Commission, the Affordable Housing Trust, and the Housing Partnership Board. So it had brought, you know, and there was a working group that worked on it bi-weekly for 8 months. So it was a coalition that got it through, but we got it through. Let's see, let me back up into the chat. Okay, somebody said, I struggle with current housing solutions for people who aren't DDS priority 1, given the desire to live with peers. Do you have recommendations for how to work with developers, state financing, community to create some more supported housing, group housing setups for those who don't qualify for priority 1? Well, one of the challenges, again, is that you've got people can't afford more. Most people can't afford more than $1,000 a month out of pocket. And there are private arrangements now out there, but they cost more than $1,000 a month out of pocket. So those are effectively out of reach for most people. I think that there could be ways to do this. I think that one way to do it Well, I can think of another number of ways to do it. And in fact, I'm working with the Medfield Affordable Housing Trust right now to try to figure out up to 3 housing models. We're currently in the process of doing a survey of stakeholders to find out what might meet folks' needs. We're basically giving them a stripped down, simplified version of the survey that we just talked about. And the Affordable Housing Trust in that town is interested in putting money into possibly up to 3 housing models. I think that that is a fairly structured approach. On a really easy approach, which is what I call fraternity group rush. You can tell I went to a college with fraternities in the 80s, but what this means is get your posse together of, 3, 4 other families and apply to the same subsidized housing building. So, if there's a 20-story affordable housing building in your town, you get on that waiting list at the same time with 3 or 4 other people. You're not all going to get in at the same time, but if you all apply at the same time, it won't be that far off. And eventually you will have your cohort in the building. And so it is still included in the community, but you've got that community of people. And that puts a bunch of eyes on the situation. So you could do that with, private affordable housing. If families have money, they could do it in a condo building, but you could do it either way, and you would not have to have deep pockets to do that if you targeted an affordable housing building. How do you see the current very significant staffing shortage affecting all autism housing programs and plans? It's a problem. It is a huge problem, which is why I think we need things like programs coming out of the vocational schools, and why I think we need, programs that give people 2 years of free community college in exchange for, working with adults for 2 years. We've got to get a handle on it. I mean, a huge part of the problem is simply that it doesn't pay enough. And the ARC has been doing a lot of work on that in terms of getting more money into the system, because the reality is if you can make $18 an hour at Dunkin' Donuts, why are you going to take a job at $17 an hour working with an adult with disabilities? And yes, it can be fulfilling, but fulfilling doesn't pay your rent either. So yeah, it's a problem.
Hey, it's Desiree again. I don't know if it would be appropriate in your context, but I found it very helpful to, after doing a market analysis, you have the data, which is really exciting to gather leaders that are not in the disability bubble. So I've intentionally reached out to, the mayor's office, the planning departments, the PHAs, and just invite them to look at this data with you and invite them to listen to the barriers and brainstorm the opportunities. And this type of workshop kind of has, one, raises awareness that this population actually exists and needs affordable, accessible housing, but might be able to open the doors to funding streams that aren't necessarily public. Right now, there's a lot of ARPA money, getting kind of tossed around, and not everything is completely public, and they're still trying to figure out what to do with it. So having like a gathering of leaders, an intentional gathering of leaders with the purpose of looking at the data, could possibly be helpful. It has been in other places, at least.
That's a really interesting idea, Desiree. And that may also be, I'm just thinking out loud here, that may also be of use in relationship to the accessory dwelling unit bill. Because one of the reasons it hasn't passed yet is because, you know, it's not like Mass municipalities is a fan of the idea of accessory dwelling units. But on the other hand, I don't think Mass municipalities has any clue as to the fact that this population is out there and needs housing. So that might be of real utility in that context. I think that was part of why we were able to get the thing through Winchester Town Meeting, was because we were able to demonstrate, you know, using enrollment data and census data, how many people there are in town who you know, who have disabilities. And we were also able to interestingly show that most people with disabilities moved out of town by their late 30s. They were not able to stay in town because there was not appropriate housing for them. So we were able to show that that population was there. And we were also able to show that there were services people could not access for their family member that had real dollar amounts, large dollar amounts connected to them because they couldn't establish a legal separate unit. So I think that's an interesting idea. Thank you.
So I just want to have a follow-up question to that. Desiree, who are the public figures that we would ask to look at the data?
So we've had, you know, everything from, if you have relationships with elected officials, it's awesome to try and get, you know, some of their staff in there. Looking at DEI staff in your local community. So a lot of local communities now are having like diversity, equity, inclusion specialists. The PHAs would be valuable. Looking at your affordable housing associations, any of the big developers, Enterprise, Mercy, Dominium. There's a you know, you just kind of cast a wide net, but if you can put out there, like, at this day, at this time, we're going to look over this data and then just see what happens, you know, just kind of figure out what happens.
Right. And just to interject here, Lee, you know, the developers that Desiree just reeled off, they're not really in Massachusetts. Desiree's out in Colorado. She works with the National Association, but the principle remains for the large developers here.
This is Fran Stanley again. I hope that everyone who participated in this call will pay attention to Autism Housing Pathways. And when calls go out, it would be great to have your support, or have you heard of this idea? That sort of thing can help, because each one of you can reach out, if you're in Massachusetts, to all of your connections. And that can really help when we're trying to get a demonstration project or just attention on a particular issue. And I think the survey kind of shows that there are gaps, and some of that gap is money, but a lot of that gap is awareness. And so we have to make that first, bridge the awareness gap first.
And thanks to Fran, who's the AHP vice president.
Hi, I'm a parent of a daughter with ASD, and I'm sorry I jumped. This is my first time attending this group, and I jumped in late, so I'm not sure what I missed. And I don't want to bore everyone with my particular questions in my particular situation, but how would you advise a parent to begin, or as far as housing? Do you recommend a book Do you, where is there? What would you, where would you recommend a parent start, or is there
So
something that,
it's essentially, Paula, that's what we do. And so we start, if you go to the Autism Housing Pathways website, which is autismhousingpathways.org. And you can dive in one of two manners. You can either look at the roadmap on the homepage, or if up at the top you see the thing that says Housing Boot Camp, it will walk you through a set of steps from less complicated to more complicated to walk you through the process. But basically, you know, the summary is it's a 5 to 10 year process. And so you need to start early. But those steps are designed to help you find a way through the process.
okay, that's terrific. I was not aware of your group before. I'm not even sure how I came across it, but I saw it, and after having met with a DDS person who the meeting, well, I realized that I'm going to have to do a lot of digging. And okay, I will start there. I will start there.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And actually I loved what you said about the buckets. That's very helpful. My daughter has we have lots of providers, but in terms of, it's like we have people, but we don't have designated jobs or designated, you know, it's like a lot of support systems, but no concrete identified work. And you know, and we need task-oriented help, and
Yeah.
I guess it's so I'll go there, but thank you so much. This has been
You're
very
welcome.
helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so all right, does anybody have anything else? Again, I'm just going to start to share the screen real fast again, so that I can show everything is located on the website. Oops. If I can get to the website, hold on. All right. So again, this is Autism Housing Pathways. I'm on the page where I'm going to come back to, but I want to show you how to get there, as well as just grabbing the URL. Okay, so this is autismhousingpathways.org. You can see here is the roadmap. You can see here is the housing boot camp I just referred to. And in terms of the survey, if you go to about and click on new and noteworthy, you can see we've got the results of the housing survey here. And the slides that I used tonight are this first link right here. So coming back into the chat, let me paste. So that's the link to the slides. And that's about it. All right. Thanks everybody for coming. Lee, I know I owe you a call and we'll connect about the holiday.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
This
Thank
was
you.
great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.